Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Bidenomics, specifically the recent announcement that the White House is going to be negotiating drug prices with drug companies. And of course, the word negotiating has to be in scare quotes here. Here to untangle some of the legal, constitutional, and perhaps also economic implications of this recent announcement is James Valliant. James, welcome back to the show.
Oh, well, wonderful to be here with you, Nicholas, as always. I hope your day is finding you well.
Definitely. So can you give us a little bit of the background of this announcement? From the short clip that I saw from Biden's announcement, he's announcing this as a new deal for patients, ominous wording there. Of course, there's a lot of rhetoric in his announcement about big pharma. I'm the first president in 3 decades who's going to take on big pharma and so on. Can you disentangle the rhetoric from the actual facts here, or give us a little bit of the basic background of what this announcement entails?
When Biden was elected president, one of the things he got through Congress was what was called the Inflation Reduction Act, probably the central legislative achievement of the Biden administration. Most of it, of course, had absolutely nothing to do with inflation. It was environmental policy mostly, but there were aspects that at least in motive addressed controlling prices, and this is one of them. One of the aspects of that bill requires that drug companies negotiate, as you pointed out, with the federal government over the price of certain drugs. It's going to start with only 20, and then could go up to 60, and it won't kick in until 2026, I believe. On the other hand, this negotiation is no such thing. Is absolutely no such thing. What it is it's a false front for naked price controls, in my view. And as our audience is probably aware, price controls, as anyone who understands economics 101, anyone who understands basic economics at all knows that price controls necessarily are counterproductive. They lead to shortages. Very often they don't reduce prices at all. And this is a classic case of that. What it requires is that the pharmaceutical companies negotiate with the federal government, but the federal government, in effect, tells them the price, and if they disagree with that price, they are subject to an excise tax just on that company for that drug of up to 1,000% excise tax. A 1,000% excise tax. So furthermore, it sort of takes away from the drug companies the ability to have proper hearing on their side of the case. And so the Chamber of Commerce, the leading association of pharmaceutical companies, and several of the drug companies from Merck and Pfizer on down the line have all filed suit claiming that this is unconstitutional.
Yes, the negotiations here it's a little bit like negotiating with a holdup man over who gets to keep the contents of your wallet, right?
Exactly right. If you don't comply with our price, expect first it'll be like 160% excise per day on that product, or 1,000% on that product. Completely draconian, penalizing, sort of criminal penalizing. It's like a fine. It's not at all a normal excise tax at all. So it is under threat. It's not a negotiation, whatever. And mind you, in the course of all this, they discourage. There's so many false premises behind this idea. It is true that drug prices are extremely high in America. What is the cause of that? Well, let's start with the fact that the FDA has all these absurd requirements that make it incredibly costly for drug companies to get new drugs approved. They not only have to prove that it's safe, but they have to prove that it's effective. In many cases, this delayed life-saving drugs from reaching the market for decades, sometimes costing hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of lives. I think of beta blockers, the heart medicine, for example. And someone who may have cancer or heart disease may be willing to take a risk rather than die in taking the drug. But of course, that's not the way the Federal Death Administration, what I call the Food and Drug Administration, approaches these things. So the cost of simply getting these drugs approved adds enormously to the cost of the drugs. And it's a purely regulatory matter. Let's take civil liability. You can be sued for any harm that your drug causes unless you get some kind of special exemption like the COVID vaccines got. Unless you get some special exemption, the drug company can be harmed for whatever harm in strict liability. Now, mind you, if I want to take an experimental drug, the company can't say, well, this is a very experimental drug. We don't know if it's going to work. In fact, it could hurt you. Can I sign a waiver? No. Such waivers, consumer waivers, are unconstitutional in America. They're unlawful according to the Supreme Court, and that jacks up the price of drugs absurdly, even experimental drugs. So in this current law, for example, they discourage the development of generic drugs and going the generic drug path, which is the thing that has kept drug prices so low. In the last 20 years, the cost of hospitals and doctors, the inflation has far outpaced the cost of new drugs in America. And why? The introduction of these generic drugs. Exactly what this so-called Inflation Reduction Act discourages drug companies from doing. So on a number of levels, it may actually drive up the price of drugs, whether the government wants to do that or not, or has that in mind or not. It will certainly cause, and that's what the drug companies are basically complaining, a dramatic reduction in medical innovation. They will no longer have the resources. See, if your attitude is anti-profit, I don't care whether it's oil company profits or pharma profits, you're anti-innovation. All development, all increases in productivity, all scientific innovation within a field comes from profits. If you oppose profit, where do you think the money comes from for drilling for more oil, or innovations like fracking? Where do you think that comes from? Profit. If pharmaceutical companies cannot profit to that degree, we will have fewer new and better medicines. QED. So in attacking profit as such, we are going to have a reduction in new medicines brought to market. And of course, American pharmaceutical companies are still responsible for the vast majority of new medicines that come to worldwide market these days. For all the evil greed in the American pharmaceutical company, and I grant you, it's become a kind of quasi-governmental regulated agency. There's a lot to complain about with Big Pharma because they are so deeply in bed with the federal government. On the other hand, and that's what's been driving up the costs, by the way, so ridiculously, medical costs. But at the end of the day, what this bill will do is probably have zero effect, or maybe a negative effect on the price of drugs, except maybe certain drugs at the expense of other drugs, right? What does the federal government tell the pharmaceutical company? Well, you can always opt out of the Medicare system. Well, Medicare, that is to say, which encompasses nearly every retired person in America. Every person over the age of 63 or 65 is basically on Medicare. And of course, they're the ones who take most of the drugs. So opting out of that system means opting out of the massive portion of the drug market as such. So it is a hold-up man from Joe Biden and the federal government. It's not going to have the effect on prices that they think it does. May have, in fact, the opposite effect. It'll only affect certain drugs anyway. And it will have a dramatic and almost demonstrable, I mean, they've done several studies that show that it'll have a dramatic and demonstrable effect in reducing medical innovation. Now, of course, all of that is simply a manifestation of the fact that the free market rights of consumers and companies are being directly violated.
Yes, and you've mentioned that this bill is essentially a form of price control. For the benefit of our viewers, a very good resource on the subject of price control is George Reisman's book, The Government Against the Economy, which I read some months ago. The whole book is about price controls. He uses the example of petrol during the Arab oil embargo of the early 70s. He uses the example of rent controls in New York. And it's applicable to all these cases. Now, how that applies to the specific, or the point that Reisman makes, is that price controls ultimately lead to shortages, inevitably, because you lower the price of a commodity, people will buy more of that commodity. Eventually, you get shortages. And what do shortages then lead to? Rising prices, because if there's less of something, then on the long run, people will have to pay more for it. So what you just said, that far from lowering the prices of drugs, in the long run, this will probably have the opposite effect. It just follows by economic law.
And in the meantime, we're destroying medical innovation. We're destroying the creation and bringing to market of new medicines and new medical treatments by necessity. And as you say, in the long run, in the short run, we're going to have lines shortages. And in the long run, we're not going to even have the effect on the price that they claim it will have. Probably a counter effect on those prices because it only increases the governmental compliance type costs from the from the pharmaceutical companies. So no matter how you look at it, because it is such a profound rights violation against the consumer and the company in their ability to voluntarily come to a price, it necessarily is going to hurt people as a direct manifestation of that rights violation. Yes, there's economic arguments, but what people should really always bear in mind is that it is the violation of rights that is the direct cause of these negative economic consequences. The interesting part about this is that the Chamber of Commerce and several other business groups are suing the federal government under recent Supreme Court cases, which have pulled back the administrative state to a certain extent. There may have a really good case. You recall the big issue doctrine when it came to carbon emissions in the Environmental Protection Agency. The original Clean Air Act and the original Environmental Protection Act didn't cover carbon emissions way back 50 years ago. They didn't know about climate change and CO2 emissions. And so this Environmental Protection Agency all on its own said, no, we're going to start regulating CO2 emissions. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. If it's a big change in your authority, EPA, you got to go to Congress. Congress has to give the regulatory agency that authority, or it's a violation of the Constitution. Furthermore, this separation of powers argument is a good one. Furthermore, this due process argument, they're calling it a negotiation, but in fact, the other side doesn't have any real input in the rulemaking authority on Big Pharma here. So there could be a due process violation. There could certainly be a big issue violation in the new understanding of things that the Supreme Court is bringing down. So and there are several other constitutional challenges that they're making, but those are the big ones in my mind. So I think it'll be very fascinating to see what the current Supreme Court, which is leaning more in that direction, will do with this, because surely this exceeds. I hear the federal government, they say there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents us from imposing whatever price controls we want. Well, no, they've got it all wrong. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives them any power to regulate the medical industry or the power to regulate any wager price in the United States in the first instance. So I don't think we'll get that far from the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court may clip their wings a bit by saying, hey, this is a big change and you need to go to Congress to get that kind of authority. Make sense?
I'm glad you brought up the Supreme Court, because that was going to be my next question. If the drug companies do challenge this new bill, how likely is it that this may eventually find its way to the Supreme Court? And given that we now have that you in the States have an overwhelmingly conservative Supreme Court, that the judgment could actually be favorable towards the drug companies' legal rights?
Well, their odds of getting it heard in federal appellate courts have gone way up because they've filed it in so many different districts. They've, talk about a scattershot, buckshot approach. They've filed it in just as many courts of the federal courts of this land and local courts of this land as they can, which definitely increases their chances, especially the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has been particularly skeptical of government power grabs of late. And as I say, just last term, we had, and a couple of years before that, we had interesting new cases from this Supreme Court saying that the regulatory agencies just don't have this carte blanche authority that they think they have. So when it gets to the Supreme Court, I won't predict. I can't be certain as to how it'll come down. A lot will depend upon the opinions of justices like Roberts and Kavanaugh, and I'm not quite sure where they would come down. On the other hand, there's a good chance it will get struck down under this new direction the Supreme Court is going in, and these litigants have sure done the strategically correct moves to get it there.
We've heard quite a lot recently about Republican opposition to the Inflation Reduction Act. And just in the last few days, in response to this particular announcement, this particular bill, there's been opposition from Republicans. There's supporting these lawsuits on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies. Perhaps the arguments they made are not quite as principled or quite as fundamental as we'd like. But could you say a little bit about the Republican response to Biden's recent announcement?
Not only have at least a large number of Republicans actively supported the lawsuits going on here, they want to change that aspect of the law. They want to repeal that aspect of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act that has to do with this negotiation of medicine prices. And I'm not, of course, obviously, should it even pass the Republican-controlled House, and it's a very closely held, the numbers are pretty close there. So I'm not sure if it'll pass the House just to excise this. But even if remove this from the bill, but even if it should pass the House, I don't see it going anywhere in the Senate, and I certainly see it getting a veto from the president. But good for the Republicans. It's true they don't have a consistently free market case on this, but on the other hand, they are correct. This will reduce medical innovation. This is punitive against pharmaceutical companies, and this may be counterproductive at the end of the day, even to saving old people on expensive drug prices.
Well, I have a few questions specifically about the pharmaceutical industry, but before we get to those, let's just check in with Daniel and see, do we have any comments or super chats from our viewers yet?
We have a super chat from Jonathan, thank you so much, and also a super chat from Maria-Leen. She's saying, this is going to negatively affect Pharma's runway to get drugs through approval, as well as adding new drugs to their pipeline.
Absolutely, and James, that's actually touches on a point you were making earlier, the threat to innovation, the threat to future drugs.
That's it. People who oppose profits in an industry, I mean, it doesn't matter what the industry is. The example that Professor Reisman uses, for example, with oil price controls in the 70s is very indicative. Richard Nixon, when inflation was starting to go up in America in the 70s, imposed widespread wage and price controls. Most of those were lifted because they were so stupid and counterproductive. One of them that remained was on the petrol price at the gas station. And what did that result in? Shortages of petrol at gas stations. I remember as a kid, there were lines. We had a rationing process. If your license plate ended with an odd number or an even number, that was the day you could go and actually fill your tank with gasoline. And so those kind of lines and shortages were chronic in the 70s. Production of oil was low because there's really no incentive of the profit because of the lower profits for companies to make more oil. Ronald Reagan, for all his problems, within 1 week of becoming president, signs a deregulation of the consumer price of petrol at the gas station. Boom! Within 2 years, there's a glut of petroleum on the world market because of just simply from that fact. The lines go away, the shortages go away. And why? Why, ladies and gentlemen? Profits are the source of more oil. If you try and control the profits of the oil companies, what you're saying is, I don't want more energy. I don't want more oil. Because where do you think new oil rigs are kind of expensive. They can cost hundreds of millions, billions of dollars just to build. And it takes profits. And if you want innovation, if you want more efficient ways of getting at oil, profit is exactly where all that comes from. If a price goes up, just standard economics, if a price goes up, that sends signals to both the consumer and the producer. It says to the producer, hey, the price is going up, profitability is going up, rush into that market and make more. And that'll, in the long run, moderate the price, which is exactly what happened with oil in the 80s. And to the consumer, it says to the marginal consumer, you can cut back a little bit. Don't take that extra driving trip you needed, just for pleasure this weekend. And so in the meantime, consumers cut back a little bit. Producers rush in to produce more, and the signal of a higher price. We have to let the free market price go up if those signals are to work. We have to let companies make profit if we want more of the product and more innovation in those products. And whether it's petroleum or pharmaceuticals, the same principles apply.
Now, we talked a moment ago about some of the positive aspects of the Republican response to this new bill. But there's a dark side here as well. We've talked a lot on this channel about how god-awful Trump is and how awful he is on basic economics and how awful he is for business. I actually read a quote from Trump in connection with this Biden bill where he was essentially advocating something similar. Trump was saying, oh, the drug companies, they've been ripping us off for too long and this has to end. Essentially, his philosophy is, you can barely distinguish it from that of Biden and the Democrats.
Oh, indeed. Donald Trump is in effect what we used to call it. When I was a younger person, the economic policies promoted by Donald Trump would be called sort of a labor Democrat, a left-leaning economic policy. It was the labor unions that wanted to restrict immigration, for example, to keep wages up. It was labor unions, for example, you go right down the list that want tariffs, of course, to protect local industries. It is, of course, Donald Trump has always said that every American should have the right to medical care provided by the federal government. He's always believed in some kind of federal program that would guarantee everyone medical care in this country. It's not as though he opposes the principle, in effect, of socialized medicine. And a growing number, much more disturbing than this, a growing number of Republicans have thrown away any allegiance to the free market, whatever. And this is driving a lot of rank and file Republicans into having absolutely no understanding of economics and American history on the subject, whatever. But you've got your Tucker Carlsons, you've got a bunch of Republicans in Congress, you got Donald Trump. They're absolutely in favor. They hate big companies. They hate big tech, whether it's Facebook or X. They hate social media companies. And of course, they hate big pharma. Now, as I said at the very beginning, it is government regulations that have been driving up the price of drugs in this country. It is government regulations that are responsible for this. And rather than addressing those, which have been driving up the cost of medical costs in general through the course of my entire lifetime, what they're doing is they're adding these artificial controls that I think will only make matters worse and destroy innovation in the field.
Speaking of regulations, you alluded earlier to the fact that because the pharmaceutical industry is so heavily regulated, the industry itself is not completely innocent in all of this. There are some serious problems with the big drug companies. Can you talk a little bit about how the drug companies have been complicit in this government stranglehold on medical care and pharmaceuticals?
Well, every regulation is, in fact, a helper to any company that is already in the market and wants to keep out new competition. Every regulation is pro-coercive monopoly because every regulation increases the cost of entering that business and makes it more expensive for a new company to hang out their shingle and compete with the existing businesses. And every new cost that's added to that can only increase the pharmaceuticals' monopoly control over it. Can you imagine trying to start a company that would compete with Merck or Pfizer or Moderna? Can you imagine the billions of dollars in startup capital and investment capital you need just to comply with the regulations, just to meet the hurdles of all this? No. And so they have this monopoly privilege, in effect, that is the result. Not only does the FDA kill people, but the FDA's costs create a sort of a coercive monopoly privilege on the part of those companies that already exist. As in the case with nearly every other industry, it is the big companies that already exist in that industry who are ganging up with government to create a regulatory scheme. This is true of the securities industry on Wall Street. This is true of, I can just keep going down the list. The pharmaceutical companies are very much in bed to keep the costs up, to keep competition out so that they continue to have their monopoly over the situation. And of course, all of these regulations only encourage a lack. See, if you've got a minimum standard, there's a market for integrity that's destroyed with these minimum government regulations, because instead of people looking for, hey, is this drug really good? Should I really talk to should certification of this drug be privately handled or publicly handled? I'm going to trust those private guys, those good housekeeping seal of approval guys over some government regulator, because they're going to go out and test it, like they test cars and so forth, and tell me whether the thing is safe and effective in a much more reliable way, in a way that they have a profit motive to tell the truth about. So I'm going to talk to doctors, and I would much prefer private certifications on safety. Thank you very much. Those will work out much better. And these regulations destroy the market for integrity. So in fact, what you have are big companies that can push opiates, for example, because there's some kind of government regulation that helps them get away with that, even if it's costing all kinds of addiction and death out there. So yeah, all kinds of abuses. None of the protections, none of the hygienic cleansing effect of the free market can really take effect the more draconian and complex and Byzantine the regulations are. What it does is it creates an elite set of companies sort of that are fat and comfortable and working hand in glove with the government to help keep out competition and keep their prices high.
One of the arguments that's used to justify Biden's new bill is, well, drug prices in the United States are on average twice as high as they are in Canada, Germany, other European countries. What's the solution to all of this? If we had an ideal solution, an ideal free market solution to bring drug prices down, so you've talked about competition, deregulation, get rid of the FDA. But what is the kernel of the solution here?
If it's particularly the prices of medicines, pharmaceutical prices, then get rid of the Food and Drug Administration. They impose an enormous percentage of the cost of new drugs Another thing we might want to get rid of are these stupid rules that say innovative and potentially dangerous products the consumer can't waive liability on. If consumers could simply waive their civil liability, that could save drug companies hundreds of billions of dollars in liability costs. Just those two innovations, eliminate the FDA, allow consumers to waive private liability so long as they're informed about the risks, and suddenly the price of drugs tomorrow would start heading south like that. The other thing that, of course, in general keeps medical services, unlike there's two really areas where inflation is way outpaced in those areas than everywhere else, and that's in education and healthcare. Why? Because, of course, the government thinks they're so important. There's total subsidies, bottomless demand for those things. And so the prices for college tuition keep going up as they pump ever more and more subsidies to the consumers and to the schools themselves. Similarly with medical care. If the government got out of the business in general, the prices of hospitals, doctors, you name it, would start heading south in a big hurry. The reason why medical costs and educational costs have gone up is because of all of this government intervention. So the solution to lower drug prices is obviously get the government out. They're the one. Normally, the course of a price, any price in a market, is to go down, down, down. When televisions were first introduced, only the rich could afford it. But then, of course, as they began to manufacture more, it became more and more cost effective, and the competition drove the price down, 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 so that even the ordinary person below the poverty line in America today has a smartphone, a television, a microwave oven, because the price of those things went down. That's the normal tendency in the free market. Why is that trend so bucked in this particular area? Government intervention alone can explain it. All of those efforts to help, all of those efforts that the Democrats, since the Medicare Act back in the 1960s was passed to guarantee all elderly and disabled people medical care, starting with that, all of this help has been exactly what has priced the middle class out of getting medical treatment and has driven the price of drugs through the roof in my country. Yes.
All excellent points. Let's check in with Daniel one more time for any final comments or super chats from our viewers.
We have a super chat from Gail. Thank you so much. And also a super chat from Megan. Thank you. She says, a lot of runway pharma needs to fund clinical trials comes from venture capital. If drug prices can be slashed at width, venture capital won't invest.
Absolutely. That's a very good point.
Exactly the point, Megan. Great point. Like I say, where does innovation come from? But these greedy companies' profits. And if you can control their prices, and if you're saying their profits are evil, then I can QED predict that there are going to be drugs that will never come to market that would have otherwise come to market. This is going to cost lives, ladies and gentlemen. This is life and death. It's not just a matter of price.
Yeah. Daniel, do you have any announcements about upcoming shows today?
We have the reality show in a couple of minutes. Link is in the chat. And then at 10 p.m. UK time, we have Life on Earth with Robert and Amy Nasser on when the hero and the villain are the same guy.
Ooh,
sounds intriguing.
I want to just put one more plug in. This Saturday, we're going to do another one of our mock trials with the Ayn Rand Center UK. And this time it's going to be about abortion. It's going to be based on a real case a couple of years ago of abortion clinic protesters who are going to be put on trial. If you want to do that, though, you got to be a paid subscriber of the Ayn Rand Center UK at a certain level. So go to the Ayn Rand Center UK website, look at the different benefits you get from each level of subscription. But these trials are so much fun. I promise you, you will enjoy participating in them as a juror. As a juror in these trials, the discussions are just a blast. And we're going to have a great one this Saturday. So do please go to the website, check out the different subscription levels and the wonderful perks you're getting now if you are a paid subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK.
Well said. James, this is a very important and really fascinating topic. I thank you very much for suggesting it and for your contributions today. Thank you to all our viewers and subscribers. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. And until then, I wish you all the best of premises.